We should probably do some sort of introduction. So like, hi everybody, I'm Patricia.
I'm Lee.
And we're weird as fuck.
Yeah, I suppose you probably should, I guess so.
Yeah, because someday we might be famous. Okay, so. Okay, after stumbling a lot, I found the notes that I was looking for. I'm very sorry about that.
We'll just start over.
We'll pretend that last 10 minutes of our lives wasn't entirely wasted, shall we? So for this one, I'm going to rely heavily on the U.S. Navy's website and history.net. They've done a really excellent job of putting everything together. So much better than I could sorting through the interwebs to find exactly the same information. So we're going to do that. Today, we're going to be talking about the L-8 Ghost Blimp, which went out on routine patrol and returned without its crew in August of 1942.
Like a little horsey trained to come back home.
Yeah, only horses
have brains.
Yeah. The question remains, how did the blimp... Well, it didn't quite make it back home, and we'll go into that, but it tried really, really hard. So we'll share that with you. So on a Sunday morning, August 16th, 1942, it was by all accounts a overcast but calm day off the coast of San Francisco. The U.S. Navy blimp... L8, I don't know if it had any specific fancy name.
I'm sure they had some kind of name painted on it, but...
No. It just says U.S. Navy L8.
Usually they got their names painted, some picture and name and stuff on at least
Some
the big bombers.
flashing her legs.
All the bombers and
Pretty
tanks, stuff like that, a lot of them did.
So... The mission of the blimps in World War II were to patrol the coasts, looking for any sign of submarine activity, because we had entered World War II and we needed something that was light and could move slowly to look for any evidence of craft, including oil slicks, which was apparently one sure sign that there was something underwater that shouldn't be there. And we did have an issue while the Japanese Navy, aside from obviously Pearl Harbor, only made one strike against the American West Coast. They did hit several submarines that were patrolling off the coast and obviously oil rigs that were producing fuel for the war effort. So it was really important that we keep an eye out for that sort of thing and make sure that people and property were safe. And so the blimps were ideal for that. In this case, we had a two-man crew that boarded the gondola, Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Ellis Adams. Both were Navy veterans. Both had exemplary service records. They had families at home. And according to the U.S. Navy, they could find no reason why these two men would want to disappear on their own.
Yeah.
So no money problems, no problems at home. No explanation for why they would choose to leave. So that was pretty quickly ruled out, but we'll get back to that. So Cody was the senior aviator of the airship and Patrol Squadron 32. He was a 1938 graduate of Annapolis. He'd be remembered as taciturn by nature. So imagine the exact polar opposite of your dad. So this is a guy who doesn't talk much. He's very serious, very sober.
Yeah, there's quite a few men like that.
Yeah. So, and this is the 40s, so, not unusual. But all of his colleagues described him as very serious and very cool-headed. So not somebody to get excited if something were to happen. He was called by his commanding officer one of the most capable pilots and one of the most able officers under his command. Nonetheless, he was a later comer to lighter than air craft. And that was why, as the older man on the ship, he was underranked. So his boss, so to speak, was Lieutenant Junior Grade Cody, and he was only 27. And though he didn't have quite as much time in the air as Ensign Cody, he had rank, so he was in charge.
It's the way the military works.
Yep.
Can be a complete idiot and be in charge.
Well, there's no indication that either of these men were
No,
idiots.
these guys both sound like they know what they're doing.
Well, you know, every company that I've worked for, the higher up the food chain you go, the more questionable the decision-making capabilities are. So,
yeah.
We're just going to leave that there because I'm up for a performance review soon. So, just in case my boss is listening to this.
I don't give a fuck.
I know. That's beautiful. So, anywho, back to where we go. So, according to history.net, although technically senior, Cody was 11 years younger than Adams and had only 756 hours of LTA flight time. LTA would be lighter than aircraft. Adams had 2,281 hours. But the lieutenant did have a really notable achievement, which was interesting going into World War II against the Germans. In April of 1942, he'd flown the L-8 to deliver precious cargo to the Hornet. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading something else. One of the men, and which one it is escapes me right at the moment, was actually honored by the German military for his assistance with the Hindenburg disaster. So, fighting the Germans, he was, this was obviously before we entered the war, but he was awarded a military medal from the German government for...
That's weird.
Well, it's not weird because at the time we weren't fighting against them. Because remember, the Hindenburg disaster happened in the 30s.
Yeah.
When in the 30s, I didn't research because, I don't know, it didn't seem important at the time. But, we all know about the Hindenburg. It blew up. It went poof. Anyway, so back to Adams. In April of 42, he'd flown an L-8 to deliver precious cargo to the USS Hornet, which is a CV-8, before the ship departed for Doolittle's raid over Tokyo. Cody had held the L-8 steady over the carrier's bobbing flight deck while 300 pounds of spare parts were lowered for the B-25 bombers that would be used in the attack. And that's no mean feat.
No.
Because the Hornet was out to sea, and you've been out to sea on a Navy ship. You know that conditions can get really sketchy.
Yep. It's not fun.
So Ensign Adams had 20 years in lighter than aircraft. So Adams was the older gentleman. And he was a veteran of the Navy's Giant Rigid Airship program and had served aboard the Los Angeles, the Akron, and the Macon. Oh, and here it is. He'd even been decorated by the German government for rescuing Hindenburg passengers during the airship disaster. Again, I don't know when that happened. I want to say 1933, but I'm probably lying. I should have researched that. Anywho.
Too late now.
Too late now. So, although Adams was more experienced, he'd only received his commission the day before he'd gone out. So, this was his first flight up in an L-8, which really is irrelevant when you consider how much experience he'd had in these in general. It's like saying a pilot with 2,000 flights is a rookie because today he's flying, a Cessna versus something larger. So keep that in mind. Yes, he had less experience in the L-8s, but he was serious, he was professional, and he'd been up in these kinds of crafts plenty. So their flight was scheduled to fly over the Farallon Islands, which was 30 miles west of San Francisco, and then head north to Point Reyes, and then south to Montara, I think it's Montara Beach, before returning to Treasure Island. So they were going out and then up and back along the coast, looking for any incursion. The patrol was supposed to take about 4 hours. They were expected to return to the base sometime between 10 and 10:30 in the morning. So it should have been routine. The skies were calm. Things were fairly clear. There was no weather moving in. There was no anticipation that there was anything strange that was going to happen. And yet we're talking about them. So clearly something weird happened.
Yeah.
So they took off on time at roughly 6:30 in the morning. And according to this, they lifted off at 6:03. But according to other accounts, they didn't actually get underway until closer to 6:30. Cody was at the controls. Winds were light and variable at 4 knots per hour, according to logs. They had a ceiling of 800 to 1,000 feet. And these crafts, it's worth noting now, we'll visit it again later, when they hit 2,000 feet, they had a device which automatically vented to prevent them from going any higher. So it vented hydrogen so that they would come down on their own. And that's actually a relevant point. But their ceiling for their mission was 800 to 1,000 feet. So their patrol was a 50-mile radius of San Francisco. Once they'd passed over the Golden Gate and headed southwest toward the Farallon Islands at 7:38 a.m., an hour and a half into the patrol, Cody radioed their position as 4 miles east of the Farallones. 4 minutes later, he sent a second message. Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by. So, like I said earlier, an oil slick in the water was often indicative of a craft in the water. So they anticipated that it could potentially be a submarine. And a submarine that close to San Francisco Bay was something that was worth noting. It needed to be investigated. So they dropped down. And they dropped, according to the records, 2 Mark IV float lights. So that's a smoke-producing flare-shaped light, like an aerial bomb. Because this is 1942, we don't have the automated LED fancy stuff that we have now. They dropped these into the water. And they did this at 7:42 a.m. and began looking into the area to see if they could determine what was causing the oil slick. When the Liberty ship Albert Gallatin spotted their smoke flares, its crew sounded the general alarm and manned its guns because they anticipated that they'd seen something that they were going to have to respond to. Sailors from the nearby fishing trawler, the Daisy Gray, also worried that the blimp was about to do a depth charge because they were carrying 2 depth charges on board in addition to the guns that they had. So they pulled their nets and prepared to evacuate the area.
Smart.
Yeah.
Get the fuck out.
I know. We've got people who are thinking, which I love. But they didn't drop any bombs. Instead, they circled the area for more than an hour. The blimp was close enough to the Daisy Gray that the trawler's first mate could make out 2 men in the gondola, one of them with dark hair. So obviously they had a good view of these people. So an hour into this patrol of the area, into scrutinizing this oil slick, the Daisy Gray was able to verify that, yeah, they're still on board. The L8's identification had been removed from its outer envelope. It was still painted on the control cabin, however. And obviously, it's a blimp. You're not going to mistake it for something else.
No.
So there's no doubt that the Daisy Gray, when they claimed that they saw the L8, they did. There's not a lot of them floating around above San Francisco Bay. So anyone who might, be tempted to say, well, maybe they didn't see it. Maybe they saw something else. Nah, they saw a blimp. There was exactly one blimp in the area with 2 dudes in the gondola.
They're not too hard to identify.
Yeah, I like to think that these guys are more intelligent than that. So as they watched through the binoculars, the blimp circled at 200 to 300 feet, at one point descending to 30 feet above the water, as if the crew wanted a closer look of what was in the water. Then, shortly after 9 in the morning, the L8 dropped ballast, rose, and headed back towards San Francisco. They regularly patrol the California coast, and nobody thought anything of seeing them, heading up the coast. Meaning, it wasn't anything that caused people to say, hey, look, there's a blimp. In spite of what the Superman promo tells you, people aren't looking up into the sky for birds and planes. We see it, we move on with our lives. Thus was the case with a blimp at the time. It was pretty common to see them. The L8 had broadcast the last message at 7:42, the one that I told you about where they said saw an oil slick going in for a closer look. After that, wing control, which is what they called the flight control back at Treasure Island, tried repeatedly to reestablish radio contact and were unable to. So 7:42 a.m. was the last time anybody ever heard from them.
That's when the aliens came and took them.
Well, the only problem with that theory, aside from, aliens, is that nobody saw anything. They were watching the ship with binoculars, and they didn't see anything. Squadron headquarters wasn't told of the Blimp's radio silence until 8:20 in the morning. So I don't know how often they're supposed to radio in. I do know that according to reports, it's not uncommon for them to lose contact with it wasn't uncommon for them to lose radio contact, probably because it's 1942.
Yeah, you get too far away and it won't work.
I mean, even now, if I go stand in by the dishwasher in the kitchen, my cell phone won't work. So technology sucks. But by 8:50 in the morning, 2 Vought OS-2U Kingfisher float planes were sent to search for the blimp. Other aircraft in the area were also alerted to be on the lookout for this craft. The next indication of the whereabouts of the blimp didn't come until 10:49 in the morning. So remember, they were supposed to arrive back at base by about 10:30. So at this point, they're already 20 minutes past due when a Pan American Clipper pilot reported seeing them over the Golden Gate Bridge. He spotted nothing wrong with the ship, which he said appeared to be under control and heading back to base. At 11, approximately 10 minutes later, one of the Kingfishers reported seeing the L-8 3 miles west of Salada Beach, rising through the overcast at 2,000 feet. Remember that I said that it had a device to prevent it from going any higher. Mm-hmm. So this is the first indication that we have that it may be under the pilot's control, but not necessarily.
Doubtful.
Because it hits 2,000 feet, and then a few minutes later, it began to descend. So because of that device, it could be descending on its own, or it could be because it's under the control of a person. We don't know. So normally, crewmen would have avoided surpassing that pressure height, but it's possible that somebody was on board and had the blimp ascending for some purpose that is unknown to us. But evidence tells us that that's probably not the case, that it was probably rising of its own accord, but we don't know why it would be on a controlled course for 2 hours and then suddenly not. The next sighting of the L-8 was by an Army P-38 pilot who spotted the blimp near Mile Rock. He said that there was nothing amiss and assumed that it was headed back towards Treasure Island. It was going in the correct general direction. A few minutes later, an off-duty seaman, Richard Quam, was heading off for a day at the beach because he was off duty, party time. And he was driving along the coastal highway between San Mateo and San Francisco when he spotted the L-8 in the distance and noted that the blimp was bent in the middle. So that's our first real indication that something is very wrong. He stopped to snap a photograph, but his film was confiscated by the authorities, so we don't have a picture of it.
Of course.
At approximately 11:15 the same morning, 5 hours after the L-8 left Treasure Island, they were approaching the shore of Ocean Beach in San Francisco, which was about a mile south of Fort Funston. A single bather who was, they say bather on history.net, but we know here, being from the West Coast, that means sunbather, somebody who was out hanging out, getting some sun. Because we here on the West Coast, we don't get a lot of vitamin D, so we take it when we can.
California gets lots of that.
Well, San Francisco, they get a lot of fog. They get a lot of weather that rolls in, so it's not as bad as Washington, but it's not as good as San Diego. So he noticed that the blimp was hanging about 50 feet offshore, and its motors were silent. So even that close to the shore, you should have been able to hear those motors running.
Yeah.
And he noted that they were silent, that the bag was sagging noticeably, and it was moving broadside to the wind, only about 50 feet above the water. So basically at this point, it's dead. And the only reason it's in the air is probably because the hydrogen hasn't been exhausted. The blimp touched down briefly on the beach and then moved inland until its gondola hit the side of a hill, which packed a starboard engine full of dirt and silt and leaves, and bent the propellers. The blow also knocked loose one of the depth charges.
Awesome.
Which obviously freaked people out. It's worth noting that a depth charge is called a depth charge because they won't detonate until they reach a certain depth in the water.
Yeah.
So while a depth charge rolling down the beach at you is not ideal, it's probably not going to go off. But still, the depth charge being released just enough ballast because they're like 325 pounds, that the blimp then, it boosted the blimp up. So it rose, it cleared the embankment, and it disappeared from sight. Later in the morning, some golfers at the San Francisco's Olympic Country Club, so snazzy, stopped and watched the blimp as it flew overhead. They probably didn't realize that the remaining depth charge couldn't, blow up on them, but they were aware that there was one left. They could see it, and so they gave it a nice wide berth. Which I don't think is unwise. I mean, yeah, it's probably not going to explode, but maybe.
If it drops from a distance, I mean, it's basically a keg of black powder.
Well, honestly, it's 325 pounds. If it lands on you or your vehicle, you're fucked, whether it goes off or not.
Yeah.
I would steer clear. That's just mine. One member of the country club reported to have seen a parachute descending from the L8 while the blimp was still offshore. There's a few reports of people who say, including a 17-year-old, who said that they could see members of the crew at this point. But aside from their eyewitness accounts, and we know that eyewitness testimony can be really, really faulty.
Yeah, bad.
Yeah. So by this time, obviously, people were taking notice of the blimp limping along into San Francisco. It's not something you see every day. A healthy one flying above you, yeah. One that's bent in half, missing a depth charge, and has bent propellers on one of its engines, you'd probably stop to take a look. And thousands of people did. Because we're all sick humans. We're terrible people. So the crowd included members of the Daly City Fire Department who were burning brush on a nearby hill. And they gave chase because obviously something was wrong with this craft. It was going down.
Yeah. And
being first responders, they wanted to be there to help whoever was in the gondola when it did come to rest. It descended towards the Daly City suburb just 2 blocks south of San Francisco's county line and hit the roof of several homes. A Miss Ethel Appleton heard the blimp's drag line scrape across her roof, and she grabbed her 8-year-old daughter and did a good duck into cover, because what else are you going to do? You don't know what it is. There's a blimp and it's crashing into your house. Run. I would run. Richard Johnston, who was polishing his car in front of his house, noticed the partially deflated blimp overhead and rushed to protect his mom. So you go, Richard. Take care of your mama. At 11:30, it came to rest in the middle of the 400 block on Bellevue Avenue. And somebody said you couldn't have dropped it any easier. But, yeah, it fucking crashed. It did not come down gently. And I've got a picture that I'll show you. The gondola's up on its end. The whole canopy is deflated. There's holes in it. It's a mess. So whoever said that, it's just hi. I'm sorry. So according to reports, the cabin actually nosed into a utility pole in front of the Johnston home, broke off the cross arm of the utility pole, and swung the blimp's tail into the electrical wires. So obviously people were fearing another Hindenburg because we have sparks.
It didn't blow up.
It's really amazing that it didn't. Fortunately, their fuel supply didn't ignite, and neither did the gondola or the canopy. And people who were... it hit somebody's car too, by the way. Of course.
Yeah, might as well hit a car too while you're going.
Took out, parts of houses. So obviously that hole, it came down so lightly and it couldn't have been better. Bullshit. So the firemen that had been chasing it got there shortly after the crash and surrounded the blimp and really expected to find some serious carnage inside. What they found, however, when they slashed the envelope in an effort to free the crew members, was no sign of humans. They set up a perimeter around the crash site so that they could make sure that nobody went in. And if anybody came out, they saw them. Let's see. And this is the part that I'm going to quote directly from history.net because I thought it was interesting and really pretty well written. So the inspection revealed that all 3 L8 parachutes were still on board the craft, along with the single life raft. 2 of the blimp's 5 smoke bombs were missing, but those were accounted for because the crew had used them to mark the oil slick. A briefcase containing classified material was found behind the pilot seat, and the L8's engines were in perfect working order, aside from that one that was compacted with dirt from hitting the hillside. The ignition switches were on. The blimp's instruments and flight controls operated normally, and they still had 4 hours of gas remaining in the fuel tanks. The pilot's hat was even still on the deck. So there was no evidence that anything violent had occurred to shake them loose from the gondola.
Yeah, you'd think they'd put on their, parachutes and stuff if they're going to jump out.
2 of the 3 life jackets were missing, but they were required to wear them. So the fact that if they were missing, those should have been missing as well. So that makes sense. So, of course, the U.S. Navy immediately launched an investigation, and they explored every possibility. They explored the possibility that maybe they'd run off with the Japanese as spies. But if that had happened, the classified material would have gone with them.
Yeah.
They explored the possibility that one of the men had fallen overboard when they had gone low to check out the oil slick that they found. And then in attempting to assist him, the other one had gone in too. But protocol would have required them to radio that in if somebody had fallen in before he attempted to provide any assistance. And rather than leaning out the door of the gondola like a dumbass, he would have known to send down the life raft and radio for assistance. Plus, there was a ship not far from them that would have been better suited for retrieving the missing airmen than, dropping down to basically the deck and trying to fish him out of the drink. They would have known better than that.
Yeah.
And that's why I mentioned over and over again that these guys were professionals, that they were well known for their professional conduct. Also, of course, obviously being beamed out by aliens. That's a very popular theory. I think the most likely thing would have been that something happened to knock them loose from the gondola. But again, the latches...
Said it was tented.
What?
They said it was bent.
Well... that it was
had to hit him to do that.
Well, it wasn't bent itself. Here, let me turn this around so you can see. I'm going to pull this out. So this is what people were seeing. So
Looks
note
like
that
it's low on hydrogen is what it looks like.
So when they were saying that it was bent, it was the blimp that was bent, not the gondola. The gondola's intact.
That's from just not having enough hydrogen.
Exactly, which would have happened when they hit the 2,000-foot ceiling and it vented.
Yeah.
So that's to be expected. What isn't to be expected was that they would have hit that 2,000-foot ceiling anyway. See, this is what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
There's an intact blimp.
That's weird. And if they didn't search for their bodies,
and they did actually, and that's what I'm getting to next. With the whole, this is what I meant when they said it couldn't have come down more gently. Fucking liar!
That is not a gentle landing.
That thing crashed hard. That is not a gentle landing. That did some damage. It would eventually go on to become a Goodyear blimp, but that's later on in its life. It did. It was the Goodyear blimp. Which seems like a good way to be haunted, but that's another story. So because they had marked the area of the oil slick and because 2 other craft had seen them, the U.S. Navy knew exactly where to go looking if somebody had fallen out while they were low. And despite calm seas and clear skies, and the men obviously would have had their life vests on, they found no trace of them.
It's definitely weird.
And to this day, like I said, that was 1942, so that's been almost 80 years now. No trace of the men was ever found. So if they had been on the craft when it came ashore at any point, or if they had parachuted off, they would have still had to come through San Francisco or Daly City, one of the most highly trafficked areas on the West Coast at the time. And nobody ever saw them. Their wives never heard from them again. There was never any activity on any of their financials. They just vanished. And the U.S. Navy has never been able to provide an explanation as to what happened to them. Like I said, the most likely is that somehow, some way, these two professional, serious military men managed to get their dumbasses knocked out of a gondola and into the ocean, which seems, I mean, given everything we know about them, pretty unlikely. But it's still the most likely explanation because aliens, I mean, come on. If you're going to beam two guys out of a floating craft, why those two guys there? And why did nobody see anything?
Don't know.
That's your, I can see by the look on your face, so that's your favorite explanation.
Yeah, of course.
So, yeah, that is the story of the L8 Ghost Blimp, which came home without its crew.
It's weird.
It's weird. It's real weird. Especially when you consider this didn't happen out in the middle of nowhere. It happened in San Francisco.
Yeah, they weren't far away.
It's not like it was in the middle of Montana or Alaska where it's lightly populated and you could potentially go missing and nobody could see you. And it doesn't explain why people said they saw people in the gondola, and yet when they opened the gondola, there was no people.
Who knows?
That, I think, comes to human perception. We see it because we expect to see it there. But they weren't there. So anyway.
Fun.
I thought that was a fun story. Well, not a fun story for their families, obviously.
No, that wasn't a fun story for them.
But I think it's fascinating. So, tell us what you think. Send us messages. We love the messages.
Join us, like us.
Join us, like us, follow us, subscribe. Wow, that was really creepy. Anyway.
Follow us.
No, that was really creepy.
Yeah.
Next time on Weird as Fuck, why Lee insists on being creepy on the microphone.
Because I like it.
Until next week. Bye.
Bye.
Want to stay connected between shows? You can find us on Instagram at WeirdAsFCK on Twitter at WeirdAsFuckPod1, on Facebook at WeirdAsFCK Send us an email at weirdasfckkpodcast@gmail.com, or come on over to our website at www.weirdasfck.com. There you can check out our blog, pick up some merch, look over our sources, and even share your weird experiences. You might even make it on a future episode. We would love to hear from you. Until then, tune in and keep it weird.